cultural production is in fact influenced and then reinforced by the growth of Islam 6 centuries later. This is how we understand this faith, but we hardly ever talk about it. We hardly ever talk about it in terms of opening itself up to the questions of how one, in fact, thinks about that broad Eastern world that stems from the East African coast. We hardly ever think about it when we think about Sidis and Habshis. Are you familiar with Sidis and Habshis? Sidis and Habshis, huh? We're in Islamic India, the Mughal Empire. And the strength of the Mughal forces are rooted in its African troops. Not just grunts, not just infantrymen, but generals. Generals who build temples, mosques, forts, and have plaques dedicated to them because of what they do in terms of building an Islamic empire. So here, we need to understand that what we think of when we think of the question of Islam in Africa is in fact something that begins at the same moment that Islam begins to spread across the North African territory. That brings us to the kind of interaction that is going to happen when we think about that West African territory or the North African. The notion that we have usually is that we're looking at contact between Berbers and Tuareg. Do we have any Berbers in the room? Ah. So this man and I could walk down the street and people would mistake us for one another. How many of you have seen a Tuareg lately? Lately, huh? My first Tuareg, I looked at him and I said, you can't possibly be a Tuareg, huh? They keep telling you that you're white. You look like me. Huh? There are these kinds of notions, all right? These kinds of modern conceptualizations about what Africa looks like and how we should separate Africa in terms of understanding, one, cultural variations, physical differences, and then the question of religion. We understand, if we look at work that goes back, I mean, it's going back, it goes way back now. I mean, it's at least half a century old. Work that looks at people among the Shikiri, or McDougall's work on the Adagos, we understand that what is happening here is that by the time we get the peopling of the North African coast, this peopling is a melange. This is a melange of Sudan and Bidan, melange of Tuaregs, Berbers, and all other kinds of Africans who, that if you move through their communities, you would see the broad array of colors that take place. Africa is there. Africa is crucial to the dynamics that go on. If we look at the movement to the west, Islam, its movement to the west, across the Maghreb, and then the great split. The split that goes to the north on one hand and to the south on the other. We need to be cognizant of how that split works. One is clearly a split of conquest. This is the northern split. This is the move into Al-Andalus. It's conquest. There's no doubt about it. The move to the Sahel, though, the move into the interior, is a move that is initially marked by commerce. And why commerce? Because what is looked at this moment by the forces of Islam is, in fact, the strength and stability of African policy at that particular moment. Somewhere around the 10th century, Takrur emerges. Now, before Takrur, there is Ghana and Mali. They are huge. They are sources of power. They are the engines of commerce. They are the political economic giants of their time. There is no economy in the West that can do its business without the golden engine of the Ghanaian and Malian state. Just wouldn't happen. And what, in fact, the Islam see are the city-states, the kingdoms, and the empires into which they must gain entry. So this is the famous trans-Saharan trade. And in this trans-Saharan trade, what needs to be recognized are those states that rest below the Saharan and have their border on that shore, what we call the Sahel. It's a meeting place. The Sahara, Arabic, the sea. Our ships, our caravans, are not drift across it, but are guided across it in a set of political, economic, and commercial relationships that are rooted in the stability of the states that receive it. And moving from the south to the north are Sudani caravaneers, who in fact are the key to the transmission of Islam on the southern edge of the Sahara. This is an African device. This Islamic movement, beginning in the 10th century, is in fact predicated on African exchanges with Arabs, in which Africans in fact bring the religion back to the States. It is initially a religion of the elite, a religion of merchants, a religion of courts. And it is a religion that is going to change over the course of several centuries to become a popular religion, particularly by the time we reach, let's say, the 15th, 16th century. And we get to what we can call the Wars of the Maghreb. These are going to be crucial in terms of the dispersal of Islam, not only from the Senegal River in the north, but as far south and as deep into the interior as the Joseph Plateau. So these become central devices for thinking about how Islam comes into being in Africa. How, in fact, you get a melange of things, you get this mixture, this richness that, in fact, makes this kind of Islam vibrant, slightly different from what we think of as the conventions. The difference is commented on by people like Ibn Battuta. You all know Ibn Battuta, right? He's an interesting character. Right? Ibn Battuta is, as my grandmother would have said, a sure enough African fellow. Now, what she would have meant by that is that Ibn Battuta was a Berber. But Ibn Battuta told everyone else that he was an Arab. And what he says here, what we can take from the meaning of what he thinks it means to be an Arab, is that being an Arab is a cultural type. He has accepted something. And it means to him that it gives him carte blanche to do a number of different things in this world of Islam. Ibn Battuta looks at Islam in Africa, and in some places he is quite unnerved by it. One might even use the word appalled. He moves into the West on his travels. He talks about the ways in which women are dressed or not dressed. He talks about, more importantly, not the question of dress, but the equality between men and women in certain states. And he comments on the relationship in which a queen can rule alongside of a king as a co-equal. These are African dynamics. These are African dynamics that are rooted, or that in fact give a certain kind of overcast to the question of Islam as it's practiced in these particular spaces. He also says these things about Africa and Islam that become important. He tells you that these Muslim states in Africa are rich, rich